The screams echoed through Millbrook's main street at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would forever divide the town's history into before and after. Windows shattered, car alarms wailed, and through the chaos, 8-year-old Marcus Chun pressed himself against the cold brick wall of Peterson's hardware store, watching as something impossible emerged from the morning mist that had lingered far too long into the afternoon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 15 feet tall, maybe more. The figure moved with deliberate steps that cracked the asphalt beneath massive feet, each footfall sending tremors through the ground that Marcus felt in his chest. But while everyone else ran screaming in the opposite direction, the boy noticed something others missed in their panic. The giant's eyes weren't filled with rage or hunger, or any of the monstrous intentions the fleeing townspeople assumed. Were filled with sorrow. Marcus had been living in Millbrook's St. Catherine's Children's Home for 3 years, ever since the accident that took his parents on Highway 9. The other kids called him Ghost Boy because he had this habit of disappearing into corners, becoming so still and quiet that adults would forget he was there entirely. It wasn't shyness exactly. Marcus had learned that being invisible was often safer than being seen. The morning the giant first appeared, Marcus had been sitting on the fire escape outside the dormitory window, sketching in a notebook he'd found. In the lost and found box, he drew constantly buildings, trees, faces of people who walked by the orphanage. Drawing made the world make sense somehow, reduced complicated feelings into simple lines and shapes. From his perch 3 floors up, Marcus watched the morning unfold in Millbrook like it had every day for the past year since he'd been old enough to climb out the window unsupervised. Mrs. Patterson opened her flower shop at exactly 7:15. Detective Rodriguez bought coffee from Sal's diner before starting his patrol. The crossing guard, elderly Mr. Kowalski, took his position at the elementary school intersection. Normal, predictable, safe. Then the mist rolled in. It wasn't weather. Marcus had watched enough mornings to know the difference between natural fog and something else entirely. This mist moved against the wind, pooling in specific areas like it had purpose. It gathered first around the abandoned Hartwell manufacturing plant at the edge of town, the place where his parents had worked before the factory closed and they'd had to take night shift jobs at the packaging facility 40 miles away. The mist grew thicker, taller, until it formed something like a cocoon around the old factory buildings. Marcus pressed his pencil harder against the paper, trying to capture the strange way the vapor seemed to pulse with its own inner light. He'd never seen anything like it, but somehow it didn't feel threatening. It felt lonely. That's when the screaming started. Marcus scrambled down the fire escape and ran toward Main Street, driven by the same curiosity that had gotten him in trouble countless times at the orphanage. Sister Margaret called it his investigative nature when she was being kind, dangerous impulsiveness when his adventures resulted in scraped knees or concerned calls from neighbors. The scene on Main Street looked like something from one of the disaster movies the older kids snuck downstairs to watch after lights out. People poured from buildings, stumbling over each other in their haste to get away from the town center. Cars abandoned in the middle of the road created a maze of metal and glass. And through it all walked the giant, each step careful and deliberate, as if he were trying very hard not to cause more damage than his mere presence already created. Marcus pressed himself against the hardware store wall and really looked not at the chaos, but at the figure causing it. The giant's skin had a grayish tint, like weathered stone, and his clothes appeared to be made from some kind of rough material that might have once been canvas or burlap, but had been worn soft by time and weather. His hair fell in long dark waves past his shoulders, partially obscuring a face that was more sad than frightening. Most people would have run. Every survival instinct Marcus possessed screamed at him to follow the crowd, to put as much distance as possible between himself And something so fundamentally wrong, so impossible. Instead, he found himself stepping away from the wall, moving closer. The giant noticed him immediately. Those enormous eyes, brown like rich soil, fixed on Marcus, with an expression of such profound surprise that the boy wondered if anyone had ever not run from him before. They stared at each other across 20 feet of debris-scattered asphalt, the impossible giant and the invisible orphan boy. "You're not afraid," the giant said, and his voice was like distant thunder, deep enough that Marcus felt it in his bones rather than just hearing it with his ears. Marcus considered this. He probably should be afraid. Everything about this situation suggested terror was the appropriate response. But looking up at this enormous figure, all he could think about was the loneliness he'd sensed in the mist, and how familiar that feeling was. "Should I be?" Marcus asked. The giant's expression shifted into something that might have been surprise, or perhaps hope. "Everyone else is. Everyone else hasn't been alone as much as I have," Marcus replied, the truth slipping out before he could stop it. The giant knelt down, bringing his face closer to Marcus's eye level, though he was still enormous, even crouched. "You're alone?" "I live at St. Catherine's, the orphanage." Marcus gestured vaguely in the direction of the brick building visible a few blocks away. "My parents died when I was 5. "Mine too," the giant said quietly. "Much longer ago than that." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that transcended the obvious differences in their size and circumstances. They were both creatures without families, without places where they truly belonged, navigating a world that seemed designed for everyone except them. "What's your name?" Marcus asked. "Thomas," the giant replied. "Thomas Grimm. And you?" "Marcus Chun." The boy paused, studying Thomas's face. "How long have you been alone?" 43 years, Thomas said, and the weight of those decades sat heavy in his voice. "I was about your age when it happened. When I changed." "Changed how?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking around at the damage his presence had caused. Cracked pavement, broken windows, abandoned cars with their doors still hanging open. "I got bigger, much bigger. And when people saw me, they screamed and ran, just like today. So I learned to stay away from places where people lived. I've been hiding in the mountains mostly, coming down only when I needed food or supplies, always at night, always careful not to be seen." "What brought you here?" "I heard about the orphanage closing," Thomas said. "Read about it in his paper. Someone had thrown away. The article mentioned that the children would be separated, sent to different facilities across the state. Some might even be put into the system in other states if there wasn't room locally." He looked directly at Marcus. "I remember what that feels like, being passed around, never belonging anywhere." "I thought maybe ... double quotes," he trailed off. But Marcus understood. "You thought maybe you could help. I thought maybe I could try. But I see. Now that was foolish. I only made things worse. Look at this mess." Thomas gestured at the chaos surrounding them. "I wanted to talk to someone about adopting children who might otherwise be lost in the system, but I forgot that people see me and think monster before they think person who might be lonely too." Marcus looked around at the destruction, then back up at Thomas. "The building damage isn't that bad. Mostly just cracked pavement and some broken windows. Nothing that can't be fixed." "The fear I caused can't be fixed as easily," Thomas said. "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But maybe people just need time to understand that you're not what they thought you were." The sound of sirens was growing louder. Police, fire department, probably the National Guard. Within the hour, once word spread about what was happening in Millbrook. Thomas heard them too, and started to stand. "I should go," he said, "before this gets worse." "Wait," Marcus called. "Where will you go?" "Back to the mountains, back to hiding." Thomas looked down at the boy with something like regret. "I'm sorry. I frightened you too." "You didn't frighten me," Marcus said firmly. You made me feel less alone. Thomas stopped moving. For the first time since Marcus had seen him, the giant's expression contained something other than sadness or resignation. It contained possibility. The orphanage really is closing, Marcus asked. Next month, Thomas confirmed. Budget cuts. The state can't afford to maintain smaller facilities anymore. Marcus nodded, processing this information. He'd known St. Catherine's was struggling. The heating barely worked in winter. There were never enough supplies, and Sister Margaret had been making increasingly frequent trips to the city for meetings that left her looking tired and defeated. But knowing it was official, that his home would disappear in just a few weeks, hit him differently than he'd expected. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked gently. Marcus shrugged. "Wherever they send me. Another orphanage probably, maybe a foster home if I'm lucky. Though most people want younger kids or kids without." He gestured vaguely at himself, not sure how to articulate the combination of quiet intensity and investigative nature that had made him difficult to place in the past. The sirens were getting closer. Soon the street would be filled with officials who would want to contain the situation, study Thomas, probably lock him away somewhere. And Marcus would go back to the orphanage to wait for whatever came next, another transition to another temporary place where he'd learn new rules and try to become invisible again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Marcus," Thomas said suddenly. "What if there was another option?" "What do you mean?" "What if you didn't have to go to another orphanage or foster home? What if you could come with me?" The suggestion was so unexpected, so impossible, that Marcus almost laughed. "Come with you where? To live in the mountains?" "I have a place," Thomas said quickly, as if he'd been thinking about this longer than the few minutes they'd been talking. "It's not much a cabin I built near a lake, far enough from any town that people don't bother me. But it's warm and dry, and there's plenty of room for two. I could teach you things, how to fish, how to identify edible plants, how to build with your hands. And you could." He paused, seeming suddenly uncertain. "I could do what?" "You could help me remember how to be around people again, how to be less afraid of the world." Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper now. "I've been alone so long, Marcus. And you're the first person in 43 years who looked at me and didn't immediately decide I was a monster." Marcus stared up at this enormous, gentle creature, who was offering him something he'd never expected to find: a family. Not the traditional kind. Nothing about this situation was traditional, but something real and chosen in theirs. The sirens were only blocks away now. Soon they'd have to make a decision. Thomas would disappear back into the mountains, and Marcus would return to a system that saw him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Or they could choose something different, something unprecedented, something that would require trust from both of them. "How would it work?" Marcus asked. "I mean legally." "You can't exactly walk into the state office and fill out adoption papers." Thomas smiled for the first time since Marcus had seen him, and it transformed his entire face. "I've been thinking about that for years, actually. Every time I read about children who needed homes, I wondered if there was a way. I've been researching, reading legal books I borrowed from libraries. There are provisions for unusual circumstances for children who might otherwise fall through cracks in the system, such as emergency guardianship in cases where a minor is at risk and immediate placement is necessary. If the orphanage is closing and you're at risk of being placed in an unsuitable situation, a court could potentially approve a temporary guardianship arrangement while a more permanent solution is found." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You've really thought about this?" "I've had a lot of time to think," Thomas said simply. "And I've wanted a family for as long as I can remember." The first police car rounded the corner onto Main Street, followed immediately by 2 fire trucks and an ambulance. Thomas tensed, preparing to leave, but Marcus stepped closer instead of backing away. "If I came with you," Marcus said quickly, "if I chose to go with you, would you promise to never lie to me? Even if the truth is scary or complicated." "Especially then," Thomas replied without hesitation. "And would you promise to let me make my own choices, even if you disagree with them?" "As long as those choices don't put you in danger, yes." Marcus nodded, his decision crystallizing. "Then I want to come with you." "Marcus, you should think about this more carefully. You barely know me. And living in the mountains, away from other people, it would be a completely different life than anything you've experienced." "I've never belonged anywhere anyway," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "At least with you, I wouldn't have to pretend to be someone else to make other people comfortable." Thomas knelt down again, bringing himself as close to Marcus's eye level as his size would allow. "Are you absolutely certain? Because once we leave, there won't be any going back to the way things were." Marcus looked around at the chaos on Main Street, at the approaching sirens that represented a return to the ordinary world of forms and institutions and people who meant well but didn't understand. Then he looked back up at Thomas, at this impossible person who had appeared in his life like an answer to questions he'd never known how to ask. "I'm certain," he said. Thomas extended his enormous hand, palm up. Marcus placed his small hand in the center of it, and Thomas gently closed his fingers around the boy, not trapping him but sheltering him. "Then we should go," Thomas said, "before they arrive and make this more complicated than it needs to be." "Wait," Marcus said. "I need to get something from the orphanage." "What?" "My notebook. The one I draw in. And there's a letter my parents wrote me before they died that I keep under my mattress. I can't leave those behind." Thomas nodded seriously, understanding that some possessions transcend their material value. "Can you get them quickly?" 5 minutes, Marcus promised. "I'll wait here." Marcus ran towards St. Catherine's as the police cars pulled up behind them, officers emerging cautiously from their vehicles, hands resting on weapons they probably hoped they wouldn't need to use. He could hear Thomas speaking to them in his deep, careful voice, explaining that he meant no harm, that he was leaving voluntarily, that there was no need for anyone to get hurt. The orphanage was in chaos when Marcus burst through the front door. Sister Margaret and the other staff members were trying to account for all the children, several of whom had scattered during the initial panic. Marcus slipped upstairs unnoticed and grabbed his notebook from the windowsill, then knelt beside his narrow bed to retrieve the sealed envelope he'd hidden between the mattress and box spring. His parents had written it together during his mother's final stay in the hospital, when they'd both known she wouldn't be coming home. It was meant to be read when he turned 18, full of advice and memories and love they wanted him to carry forward. Marcus had read it exactly once, 2 years ago, and the words had been too big, too overwhelming for his 10-year-old heart to hold, but he kept it close anyway, this tangible proof that he had been loved completely, even if briefly. Through the dormitory window, he could see Thomas surrounded by police officers, their conversation appearing tense but not hostile. The giant kept his hands visible and his movements slow, clearly trying to de-escalate a situation that could turn dangerous quickly. Marcus folded the letter and tucked it inside his notebook, then ran back downstairs. Sister Margaret caught sight of him near the door and called his name, but he was already outside, running toward the street where his future waited in the form of an impossible friend who understood what it meant to be alone in the world. "I'm ready," Marcus said, slightly breathless as he reached Thomas. One of the police officers, Detective Rodriguez, whom Marcus recognized from his morning coffee routine, stepped forward. "Son, you don't have to go anywhere with this individual. We can protect you." Marcus looked up at the detective, then at Thomas, then back at Rodriguez. "He's not kidnapping me. I'm choosing to go with him." "You're 8 years old," Rodriguez said gently. "You can't make that kind of decision." I'm the only one who can make that kind of decision, Marcus replied with a firmness that surprised even himself. It's my life. Thomas placed his hand carefully on Marcus's shoulder. Detective, I understand your concern. But Marcus is right, this is his choice. And I give you my word that he will be safe with me. Safer than he would be lost in a system that doesn't have room for children like him. Children like him? Children who see the world differently, who ask too many questions and think too deeply and need space to grow into whoever they're meant to become. Thomas's voice carried decades of understanding. I was a child like that once. I know what happens to us in places designed for everyone else. Rodriguez looked uncertain, clearly weighing his options. The situation was unprecedented. There was no protocol for a giant requesting custody of an orphan child. But there was also no immediate threat, no evidence of danger or coercion. Where would you take him? Rodriguez asked. Somewhere safe, Thomas replied. Somewhere he can learn and grow and become himself without having to hide who he is. Marcus felt the weight of multiple gazes on him, police officers, curious onlookers who had crept closer despite their fear. Even some of the other children from St. Catherine's who had gathered at the windows. Everyone waiting to see what would happen next, what choice an 8-year-old boy would make that could change the trajectory of his entire life. I want to go, Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet that had fallen over the scene. Thomas isn't a monster. He's just different, like me, and we understand each other. Detective Rodriguez sighed, recognizing a battle he couldn't win. This isn't over. There will be paperwork, investigations, legal proceedings. You can't just disappear with a child, no matter how good your intentions are. I understand, Thomas said, and when the time comes, we'll cooperate fully with any legal process. But for now, Marcus needs stability, and I can provide that. How do we know you're not dangerous? Marcus stepped forward before Thomas could answer. Because dangerous people don't spend 43 years hiding in the mountains to avoid scaring anyone. Because dangerous people don't kneel down to talk to children at eye level. Because dangerous people don't ask permission before they act. The silence stretched long enough that Marcus could hear birds singing in the distance, normal sounds of a normal day that was anything but normal. Finally, Detective Rodriguez nodded reluctantly. 24 hours, he said. Give us 24 hours to notify the proper authorities and begin the legal process. Then we'll need to know where you are and how to contact you. Agreed, Thomas said immediately. And just like that, Marcus's old life ended and his new one began. Thomas lifted him carefully onto his shoulder, and they walked together toward the edge of town, toward the mountains where Thomas had built a life of solitude that was about to become something entirely different. As they walked, Marcus looked back once at St. Catherine's, at the only home he'd known for 3 years. Sister Margaret stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, watching him disappear with a mixture of concern and something that might have been hope. Are you scared? Thomas asked as they reached the outskirts of Millbrook. Marcus considered the question honestly. A little, but not of you. Just of ... everything changing. Change can be frightening, Thomas agreed. But it can also be the beginning of something better than what came before. Marcus settled more comfortably against Thomas's shoulder, his notebook clutched safely in his arms, and watched the familiar buildings of Millbrook grow smaller behind them. Ahead lay mountains he'd never seen, a life he'd never imagined, and a future that belonged entirely to him and this gentle giant who had appeared like magic in the morning mist. For the first time since his parents died, Marcus felt like he was going home. The journey into the Cascade Mountains took 3 hours, though it felt both longer and shorter to Marcus. Longer because every step carried him further from the only world he'd ever known. Shorter because the landscape unfolding around them was so captivating that time seemed to compress. Thomas moved through the forest with surprising grace for someone his size following paths that seemed to exist only for him. Deer trails widened by decades of his passage, natural corridors between ancient trees that formed a highway invisible to normal-sized travelers. He stepped carefully around delicate undergrowth and ducked beneath low-hanging branches with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to navigate a world not built for him. "Tell me about where we're going," Marcus said, adjusting his position on Thomas's shoulder as they climbed higher into the mountains. "Paradise Lake," Thomas replied, his voice carrying easily despite the exertion of the climb. "It's a small lake formed by glacier runoff, completely hidden from any hiking trails or roads. I found it about 15 years ago when I was having a difficult time and needed somewhere even more remote than where I'd been living." Marcus sensed there was more to that story, but didn't push. "How did you build a cabin there?" "Very carefully and very slowly," Thomas said with a hint of amusement. "I had to carry all the materials up piece by piece over several years. Some of the logs I cut from trees that had fallen naturally. I was careful not to damage the ecosystem. The foundation is built into the natural rock formation, and I use traditional techniques that don't require modern tools or materials that would be difficult to transport." They crested a ridge, and the world opened up below them into a vista. That made Marcus catch his breath. Valley after valley stretched into the distance, covered in dense forest that had never known the bite of an axe. Snow-capped peaks rose like ancient sentinels, and far below, a ribbon of silver marked a river that wound through the wilderness. "It's beautiful," Marcus said softly. "It's home," Thomas replied, and Marcus heard something in his voice that spoke of years of solitude in these mountains, of finding peace in a place where his size didn't matter because there was no one around to fear it. They descended into a valley where the trees grew, so thick that the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Marcus had expected to feel frightened in such an isolated place, so far from the familiar sounds of traffic and human activity. Instead, he felt a profound sense of rightness, as if some part of him had been waiting his entire life to find this sanctuary. "Thomas," Marcus said as they walked through a grove of cedar trees that must have been centuries old, "what happened to you? How did you become the way you are?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if he'd overstepped some boundary. Then, just as he was about to apologize, Thomas spoke. "I was 9 years old, living with my aunt in a small town in Montana after my parents died in a mining accident," Thomas began. "She was kind but struggling taking care of an orphan nephew when she already had 4 children of her own and a husband who drank too much. Times were hard, and I knew I was a burden, even though she never said so directly." They walked through a meadow dotted with wildflowers that released their fragrance with each of Thomas's careful footfalls. "One day, I was exploring an old mine shaft that everyone in town knew was dangerous, but that drew kids anyway because it was forbidden. I fell through what I thought was solid ground into a cavern deep underground. When I woke up, I was lying next to this pool of water that glowed with its own light. Not bright, just a soft phosphorescence that pulsed like a heartbeat." Marcus leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. "I was hurt, my leg was broken, and I had cuts and bruises everywhere. But the water it called to me somehow. I was so thirsty, and despite knowing I probably shouldn't drink from some mysterious underground pool, I couldn't stop myself. The water tasted like nothing I'd ever experienced, clean and cold, and somehow alive." Thomas paused to help Marcus down from his shoulder as they approached a stream that crossed their path. He knelt beside the water and cupped some in his enormous hands, offering it to Marcus, who drank gratefully. "The healing started immediately," Thomas continued as they resumed their journey. "I could feel my bones knitting back together, cuts closing, bruises fading. But along with the healing came changes. I started growing that very night. Not just normal growth inches at a time, so fast I could feel my bones stretching, my clothes becoming too small hour by hour." "Were you frightened?" Terrified, Thomas admitted. By the time I managed to climb out of the cavern 3 days later, I was already a foot taller than I'd been when I fell. When I reached my aunt's house, she didn't recognize me at first. When she finally accepted that I was really her nephew, the fear in her eyes ... double quotes, Thomas's voice trailed off. She was scared of you. Everyone was. I kept growing for weeks, sometimes several inches in a single day. My aunt tried to hide it at first, telling neighbors I was sick and couldn't come out. But in a small town, you can't keep something like that secret for long. Eventually, people started talking about the boy who was becoming a monster, about whether I was still human or something else entirely. They entered a section of forest where the trees grew so close together that Thomas had to walk sideways to fit between them, carefully protecting Marcus from the branches. What did you do? I ran away, Thomas said simply. One night when I heard my aunt and uncle arguing about what to do with me, whether to send me to doctors or institutions or just abandon me somewhere, I packed what few belongings I could carry and left. I was 11 years old and already 7 feet tall. I've been living in the wilderness ever since. Marcus absorbed this story, trying to imagine a frightened child growing uncontrollably, watching the people who were supposed to care for him become increasingly afraid of what he was becoming. Do you know what caused it? The water in the cave? Thomas shrugged. I've had decades to think about it. I've read every book I could find about geology, biology, folklore, anything that might explain what happened. My best guess is that I encountered something very old and very rare, some kind of natural phenomenon that exists at the intersection of science and magic. There are stories in Native American folklore about sacred waters that could transform those who drank from them, usually as a test or blessing from the spirits. Do you think it was a blessing? I used to think it was a curse, Thomas replied honestly. All those years of loneliness, of watching people flee in terror, of never being able to touch another person without them flinching. But lately, especially, since meeting you, I've begun to wonder if maybe it was preparing me for something. Maybe I needed to be different in order to understand other people who were different. They climbed higher into the mountains, following a path that wound alongside a creek that grew narrower and more energetic as they ascended. The air became thinner and colder, but also cleaner and more alive somehow. Marcus found himself breathing deeper, feeling more awake and alert than he had in months. There, Thomas said, pointing ahead through the trees. Paradise Lake. Marcus looked where Thomas indicated and saw a flash of deep blue water nestled between towering cliffs like a jewel set in stone. As they emerged from the forest, the full scope of the hidden lake revealed itself, perhaps a mile across, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the far cliff face in a ribbon of silver and mist. The water was so clear that Marcus could see the rocky bottom even in the deepest parts. And there, built into the natural rock formation on the lake's eastern shore, was Thomas's cabin. Marcus had expected something crude and primitive, a rough shelter built for survival rather than comfort. Instead, he found himself looking at a structure that was both rustic and elegant, designed to complement the natural landscape rather than dominate it. The cabin was larger than he'd anticipated it would have to be to accommodate Thomas's size, but it seemed to grow organically from the rock itself, as if it had always been part of this place. You built all of this yourself? Marcus asked in amazement. Over many years, Thomas confirmed, setting Marcus down on a wooden dock that extended into the lake. The foundation is carved directly into the bedrock. The walls are made from logs I selected carefully from trees that had fallen naturally, and I chinked them with a mixture of clay and moss that I found nearby. The roof is slate that I quarried from the cliffs and shaped by hand. Marcus walked to the end of the dock and knelt to touch the water. It was shockingly cold and so clear that his reflection seemed to hang in space rather than on a surface. Is it safe to drink? He asked. Completely pure, Thomas said. This is glacier melt, filtered through miles of rock. It's probably the cleanest water on the continent. Marcus cupped some in his hands and tasted it. It was unlike any water he'd ever drunk, not just clean, but somehow substantial, as if it contained more than just hydrogen and oxygen. "Come on," Thomas said. "Let me show you inside." The cabin's interior was even more impressive than its exterior. Thomas had clearly spent years not just building a shelter, but creating a home. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, hand-built furniture scaled to Thomas's size, but with smaller chairs and a table that would accommodate Marcus. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with hundreds of volumes that Thomas had somehow acquired during his decades in the wilderness. "How did you get all these books?" Marcus asked, running his finger along the spines. He saw classics of literature, scientific texts, philosophy, history, poetry, a collection that would have been impressive in any library. "Very carefully," Thomas said with a smile. "I learned early on that my mind needed feeding as much as my body. I would visit libraries in small towns late at night, always leaving payment for any books I took, along with notes explaining why I needed them. Most librarians, I think, understood that knowledge shouldn't be denied to anyone, regardless of their circumstances." Marcus pulled a volume of poetry from the shelf and opened it to find margins filled with Thomas's careful handwriting notes. "Thoughts, questions, connections to other ideas. You've studied all of these?" "I've had nothing but time," Thomas replied, "and learning helped me remember that I was still human, even when the rest of the world seemed determined to convince me otherwise." Thomas showed Marcus the kitchen, which featured a wood-burning stove and shelves lined with preserved foods, vegetables he'd grown in a garden behind the cabin, fish he'd smoked from the lake, berries and nuts he'd gathered from the forest. Everything needed to sustain life in complete isolation, but arranged with a care that spoke of someone who took pleasure in the simple act of creating a home. "This room will be yours," Thomas said, opening a door to reveal a space that was clearly recently constructed. The walls were still bright with fresh wood, and everything was scaled to human proportions. A bed, a desk, shelves waiting to be filled, and a window that looked out over the lake. "You built this for me?" Marcus asked, touching the smooth surface of the desk. "I hoped," Thomas said quietly. "For years, I hoped that someday I might find someone who could share this place with me. Someone who wouldn't be afraid, who could see past the surface to whatever I am underneath all of this." He gestured at his enormous frame. Marcus set his notebook on the desk and looked around at what was now his room, the first space in his life that truly belonged to him, that had been created specifically with his needs and comfort in mind. "Thomas," he said, turning to face the giant who had given him something he'd never dared to hope for, "thank you for all of this, but mostly for seeing me, for understanding what I needed even when I didn't know myself." "We understand each other," Thomas replied, "and understanding is the foundation of family." As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus stood at his window and felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. When his parents died, the sense of being exactly where he belonged, outside. The forest was coming alive with evening sounds, owls calling to each other across the valley, the splash of fish rising to feed on insects, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. It was a symphony of life that Marcus had never heard in the city, a reminder that the world was vast and full of wonders that most people never experienced. "Marcus," Thomas called from the main room, "would you like to help me prepare dinner?" "Yes," Marcus replied, leaving his room to join his new guardian in the kitchen. "I'd like that very much." As they worked together, Thomas handling the large tasks while Marcus took care of the details that required smaller, more precise movements, Marcus realized that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not the institutional care he'd known at the orphanage, well-meaning but impersonal, but a true partnership where each person's strengths complemented the other's needs. They ate their meal on the dock as the last light, faded from the sky, and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain air. Thomas told Marcus about the rhythms of life at Paradise Lake, how to read the weather and the behavior of the birds, which plants were safe to eat and which to avoid, how to move through the forest without disturbing its delicate balance. "Tomorrow," Thomas said as they prepared to go inside, "I'll teach you to fish. The lake is full of trout, and learning to catch your own food is an important skill when you live this far from civilization." "Tomorrow," Marcus agreed, looking forward to his first full day in this new life. As he settled into his bed, the first bed that was truly his own, Marcus thought about the chain of events that had brought him here. His parents' death, 3 years at St. Catherine's, the orphanage closing, and then Thomas appearing like something from a fairy tale to offer him a different kind of future. Perhaps there was no such thing as coincidence. Perhaps some events were simply too significant to be random. Perhaps a lonely giant and an invisible orphan boy had been meant to find each other, to create together something neither could have built alone. Outside his window, Paradise Lake reflected the stars like a mirror, and Marcus fell asleep to the sound of water lapping against the dock. Finally at peace in a place where being different wasn't something to hide, but something to celebrate. Marcus woke to the sound of chopping wood echoing across the lake. Through his window, the early morning mist clung to the water's surface like silk scarves, and the sun painted the eastern cliffs in shades of amber and rose. He'd slept better than he had in months. No sounds of traffic, no dormitory full of restless children, just the gentle whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant call of a loon. He dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Thomas splitting logs with an axe that looked normal-sized in his massive hands, but would have been unwieldy for most grown men. The giant worked with methodical precision, each swing perfectly placed, each piece of wood falling exactly where he intended. "Good morning," Thomas called when he noticed Marcus. "Sleep well? Better than I have in years," Marcus replied honestly. "What are you making?" "Kindling for the winter," Thomas said, setting down the axe. "Living this far from civilization means thinking ahead. We'll need a substantial wood supply before the first snow falls in October." Marcus looked around at the forest surrounding them, acres upon acres of trees. "There's so much wood here. How much could we possibly need?" Thomas smiled. "Come with me. I want to show you something." They walked to a large shed behind the cabin that Marcus hadn't noticed the night before. Inside, stacked floor to ceiling in neat rows, was enough split wood to heat a small town through winter. "This represents about 6 months of work," Thomas explained. "Selecting the right trees, only those that have fallen naturally or are diseased. Beyond saving cutting them to length, splitting them, and stacking them to dry properly. In winter, when temperatures drop to 30 below zero and the lake freezes solid, this wood is what keeps us alive." The scale of preparation was staggering. Marcus had never had to think about survival in such concrete terms. At the orphanage, heat came from radiators connected to a gas furnace. Food appeared in the cafeteria 3 times a day, and the most planning required was making sure homework was finished before bedtime. "Will you teach me?" Marcus asked. "Everything," Thomas promised, "but we'll start with fishing today. It's a gentler introduction to providing for yourself." They spent the morning at the lake's edge, Thomas demonstrating how to read the water for signs of fish, how to cast a line with precision, how to wait with the patience that separated successful fishermen from those who went home empty-handed. Marcus proved to have natural instincts for the rhythm of fishing, the subtle feel of a fish testing the bait, the precise moment to set the hook, the steady pressure needed to bring in a catch without breaking the line. "You're a natural, Thomas," observed as Marcus landed his 3rd trout of the morning. "Most people take weeks to develop that kind of sensitivity." "I think I've always noticed small details," Marcus said, carefully releasing a fish that was too small to keep. "At the orphanage, I could tell when Sister Margaret was worried about something just by the way she walked." or when one of the other kids was about to cause trouble by how they held their shoulders. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. That's a valuable skill. In the wilderness, reading subtle signs can mean the difference between safety and danger. They cleaned their catch together, Thomas showing Marcus how to fillet the fish efficiently, how to save the bones for soup stock, how to use every part of what they'd taken from the lake. It was Marcus's first lesson in the ethics of subsistence living. Take only what you need, waste nothing, always give back more than you receive. Thomas, Marcus said as they prepared the fish for lunch. Yesterday, Detective Rodriguez said there would be legal proceedings. What's going to happen? Thomas paused in his work, considering his answer carefully. The truth is, I don't know exactly. What we've done, me taking custody of you without going through official channels, is unprecedented. There's no legal framework for someone like me to adopt a child through normal means. Because you're a giant? Because I don't officially exist, Thomas corrected. I have no social security number, no birth certificate that reflects who I am now, no address that anyone could verify. According to government records, Thomas Grimm died when he was 11 years old and never came back from a camping trip in Montana. Marcus set down his knife, the implications sinking in. So we're both invisible now. In a sense, yes. But that might work in our favor. If they can't prove I'm dangerous, and they can't, because I'm not, and if you clearly want to be here, the authorities might decide that leaving us alone is simpler than trying to create new laws and procedures for a situation that will probably never arise again. And if they don't decide that, Thomas met his eyes directly, then we'll face whatever comes together. But Marcus, I want you to know that if staying with me means you'll be in legal jeopardy, I'll make sure you're returned to a situation where you're safe and cared for, even if it breaks my heart. It won't come to that, Marcus said with a certainty that surprised them both. We belong together. Anyone who meets us will be able to see that. They spent the afternoon exploring the area around the lake. Thomas showed Marcus the garden where he grew vegetables, a surprisingly sophisticated operation with raised beds, composting systems, and irrigation channels that diverted water from a nearby stream. The plants were thriving in the mountain soil, producing enough food to supplement what Thomas hunted and foraged. I started the garden my 3rd year here, Thomas explained as they harvested vegetables for dinner. I was tired of living entirely off fish and wild plants. It took several years to build up the soil and figure out what would grow at this altitude, but now it produces more than I can eat by myself. Now you won't have to eat by yourself anymore, Marcus pointed out. Thomas smiled. No, I won't. That's going to take some getting used to cooking for two, planning meals, having someone to talk to during dinner. They worked in comfortable silence, filling baskets with tomatoes, carrots, potatoes, and herbs. Marcus found the physical work satisfying, in a way that schoolwork had never been. There was something deeply right about growing your own food, about the direct connection between effort and sustenance. As the sun began to set, they heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the valley below. Thomas straightened, his expression becoming alert but not alarmed. That will be the authorities. I expected them to come eventually. Should we hide? Marcus asked. No, Thomas said firmly. Hiding would only make us look guilty of something. We'll meet them openly and honestly. 2 helicopters appeared over the tree line, circling the lake once before landing on the flat area near Thomas's dock. Marcus counted 8 people emerging. From the aircraft, police officers, social workers, and others he couldn't identify. Detective Rodriguez was among them, along with a woman in a business suit who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. Thomas and Marcus walked down to meet them, Thomas moving slowly and keeping his hands visible, Marcus staying close to his side. Mr. Grimm, Detective Rodriguez called out as they approached. Thank you for not running. It makes this conversation much easier. I said we would cooperate, Thomas replied calmly. I meant it. The woman in the business suit stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Sarah Campbell, Director of Child Protective Services for this region. I need to speak with Marcus privately to ensure his safety and well-being." "Of course," Thomas said. "Marcus, Dr. Campbell wants to talk with you. You don't have to be afraid, just tell her the truth." Dr. Campbell led Marcus a short distance away from the group, far enough for privacy, but close enough that Thomas could still see them. She knelt down to bring herself closer to Marcus's eye level, a gesture that reminded him of Thomas's natural instinct to minimize the intimidation factor of size differences. "Marcus," she began gently, "I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer honestly. Are you here because you want to be, or because you felt you had no choice?" "I want to be here," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Has Mr. Grimm hurt you or threatened you in any way?" "No, he's been nothing but kind to me. Are you getting enough food? Do you have a safe place to sleep?" Marcus gestured toward the cabin. "Thomas built me my own room. And we caught fish for lunch and picked vegetables from his garden for dinner. I've never eaten better food in my life." Dr. Campbell made notes on her tablet. "Marcus, you understand that living here means being very far from other children, from schools, from medical care if you need it?" "I understand that," Marcus said. "But I also understand what it's like to live in a place where I don't belong, where I'm just another problem to be managed. Here, I'm part of a family. Mr. Grimm isn't your legal guardian. He can't make medical decisions for you, can't enroll you in school, can't provide you with any of the official documentation you'll need as you grow up." Marcus had been thinking about this very issue since Thomas mentioned it that morning. "Then help us fix that. Help us figure out how to make this legal. Don't just tell us all the reasons it won't work. Help us find the reasons it will." "Doctor." Campbell paused, clearly not expecting such a direct response from an 8-year-old. "It's not that simple, Marcus. There are laws, procedures, safeguards designed to protect children, safeguards that would have separated me from the only person who's ever truly understood me." Marcus interrupted. "Dr. Campbell, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you ever felt like you didn't belong anywhere? Like no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't fit into the spaces that other people found comfortable?" Dr. Campbell was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said finally. "I have felt that way. Then you know why I need to be here. Thomas and we're both different in ways that make other people uncomfortable, but we're not different from each other. We make sense together." They talked for another 20 minutes, Dr. Campbell asking about Marcus's daily routine, his plans for education, his emotional state. Marcus answered every question honestly, describing his life at Paradise Lake with enthusiasm and his determination to stay with Thomas with unwavering conviction. When they returned to the main group, Dr. Campbell spoke quietly with Detective Rodriguez and the other officials. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see Thomas growing more tense as the discussion continued. Finally, Dr. Campbell approached Thomas directly. "Mr. Grimm, this situation is highly irregular. Legally, Marcus is still a ward of the state, and removing him from official custody without authorization is a serious offense." Thomas nodded gravely. "I understand the legal implications, but I hope you can also understand the human implications." Marcus was about to be lost in a system that doesn't have adequate resources to care for children with his particular needs. "I can provide him with individual attention, education, safety, and love, everything he requires to grow into a healthy, productive adult. You're not qualified to be a teacher. I have decades of self-directed study and access to extensive educational resources," Thomas replied, gesturing toward the cabin where his library waited. "I can provide Marcus with a broader education than most schools, tailored specifically to his interests and learning style. You're not a licensed healthcare provider. The nearest hospital is 2 hours away by helicopter, regardless of where Marcus lives. But I have extensive first aid training, and the lifestyle here is far healthier than what he'd experience in an urban environment. You have no legal standing to make decisions for him. Then help us establish that standing, Thomas sighed, echoing Marcus's earlier words. Create a framework that acknowledges unusual circumstances and prioritizes the child's best interests over bureaucratic convenience. Dr. Campbell exchanged glances with her colleagues. Mr. Grimm, even if we wanted to help, and I'm not saying we do, the legal hurdles would be enormous. We're talking about creating entirely new categories of guardianship, establishing precedents that could affect family law for decades to come. Then don't think of it as creating new law, suggested a voice from behind them. They turned to see a man in a park ranger uniform approaching from the tree line. Think of it as recognizing traditional law that already exists. Ranger Collins, Detective Rodriguez acknowledged. What are you doing here? I've been tracking this situation since yesterday, Collins replied. And I think there might be a solution that everyone's overlooking. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. This land we're standing on? It's not technically part of the United States. The group stared at him in confusion. What do you mean? Dr. Campbell asked. Paradise Lake sits at the intersection of 3 different land grants dating back to the 1800s, Collins explained. Due to surveying errors and overlapping claims that were never properly resolved, this particular valley exists in a legal gray area. No county has clear jurisdiction, no state can definitively claim it, and the federal government has never formally incorporated it into any park or forest service area. Thomas looked stunned. Are you saying this land is autonomous? I'm saying that traditional legal frameworks might not apply here, Collins replied carefully. And there are precedents for indigenous communities governing themselves according to their own customs and needs, especially in cases where the inhabitants have established sustainable, self-sufficient lifestyles that don't impact surrounding areas. Marcus felt a spark of hope. Could Thomas and I form our own community, our own family unit with our own rules? It's possible, Collins said. It would require extensive legal research and probably federal court review, but it's possible. Especially if you can demonstrate that you're not asking for any government services or support, that you're completely self-sufficient, and that the arrangement serves the child's best interests. Dr. Campbell frowned. You're talking about allowing a child to grow up completely outside the normal social framework. No birth certificates, no social security numbers, no official education records, no different from many indigenous communities that exist throughout North America, Collins pointed out, and arguably safer and more nurturing than many of the alternatives currently available through official channels. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward. Even if this legal theory holds up, there would have to be oversight, regular check-ins, to ensure Marcus's welfare, documentation of his education and development, some kind of accountability structure. I would welcome that, Thomas said immediately. I want Marcus to have every opportunity to succeed in life, whether that means staying here permanently or eventually choosing to rejoin mainstream society. Regular contact with social services would actually be beneficial. It would ensure that Marcus maintains connections to the outside world and has support systems beyond just me. The group fell silent, everyone processing the implications of Ranger Collins's revelation. Marcus looked around at these adults who held his future in their hands, then at Thomas, who had already given him more stability and belonging than he'd ever known. There's something else to consider, Marcus said quietly, and all eyes turned to him. If you separate us now, you're teaching me that being different is something to be ashamed of, something that disqualifies me from normal life. But if you help us find a way to make this work, you're teaching me that differences can be strengths, that family comes in many forms, and that love matters more than convention. Dr. Campbell knelt down again, studying Marcus's face intently. You really want this, don't you? Even knowing it means growing up completely outside normal society? Dr. Campbell, Marcus said, I've never been part of normal society anyway. At least here, I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not. She stood slowly, her expression thoughtful. I need to make some phone calls. Consult with legal experts, research Ranger Collins's claims about the land status, discuss options with my supervisors. She looked directly at Thomas. Mr. Grimm, I'm going to allow Marcus to remain here temporarily while we investigate these possibilities. But I want weekly check-ins, and if at any point I believe Marcus is in danger or his development is being compromised, I will remove him immediately. Understood and agreed, Thomas said as the helicopters prepared to leave, carrying the officials back to their world of laws and procedures and bureaucratic solutions. Marcus stood beside Thomas on the dock and watched the sun set behind the western peaks. The lake reflected the sky like a mirror, doubling the beauty of the world around them. Do you think it will work? Marcus asked. Do you think they'll find a way to let us stay together? Thomas placed his enormous hand gently on Marcus's shoulder. I think that sometimes, when two people truly belong together, the universe finds a way to make it possible. And I think we've got some very smart people working on our behalf now. And if it doesn't work, then we'll have had this time together, and that will have to be enough. But Marcus, I believe it will work. I have to believe that, because the alternative is unthinkable. As night fell over Paradise Lake, Thomas and Marcus prepared dinner together in their kitchen, talking about plans for the coming day's fishing lessons, garden work, the books they would read together. They were building something precious and fragile and entirely their own, a family that existed outside all normal definitions, but felt more real and necessary than anything either of them had ever known. Outside their windows, the forest settled into its nighttime rhythms, and the lake held the stars like promises of all the tomorrows that lay ahead, waiting to be discovered together. 3 weeks had passed since the helicopter visit, and life at Paradise Lake had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and revolutionary. Marcus woke each morning to the sound of loons calling across the water and fell asleep each night to Thomas reading aloud from books that opened entire worlds of knowledge and imagination. His days were filled with learning that went far beyond anything he'd experienced in traditional classrooms. Thomas proved to be an extraordinary teacher, not because of formal credentials, but because of his genuine curiosity about everything, and his ability to connect seemingly unrelated subjects into a web of understanding that made the world make sense. Mathematics became real when Marcus calculated the angles needed to build a new storage shed. History came alive through stories of the indigenous peoples who had once lived in these mountains, whose traditional knowledge Thomas had studied and incorporated into his own survival techniques. Science was everywhere in the chemistry of preserving food, the physics of water flowing downhill, the biology of the forest ecosystem they were part of. Today we're going to study something different, Thomas announced over breakfast on a crisp September morning. We're going to learn about the law. Marcus looked up from his journal, where he'd been sketching a family of deer that had visited their clearing at dawn. The law? Dr. Campbell is visiting tomorrow for her weekly check-in, and Ranger Collins is coming with her. They're bringing news about the legal research they've been conducting. Thomas poured himself coffee from the pot that always seemed impossibly small in his massive hands. I think it's important that you understand what's at stake and what our options might be. They spent the morning going through legal documents that Thomas had somehow acquired copies of the original land grants, surveying maps from the 1800s, precedent cases involving autonomous communities and alternative custody arrangements. Marcus discovered that law was like a complicated puzzle, with pieces that had to fit together in exactly the right way to create a complete picture. The challenge, Thomas explained as they spread maps across the dining table, is that our situation doesn't fit into any existing legal category. I'm not your biological parent, not your adoptive parent, not a licensed foster parent. You're not technically an emancipated minor, but you're also not living in state custody. And this land exists in a legal limbo that complicates everything. Marcus traced the boundary lines on the surveying maps with his finger. But sometimes complications can work in your favor, right? If there's no clear law that says something is illegal, then maybe it's not illegal. That's exactly the argument Ranger Collins is making, Thomas confirmed. He's found 17 similar cases across the western United States where surveying errors created autonomous zones that operate under traditional or indigenous law rather than state or federal jurisdiction. Have any of them involved adoption? 3 have involved guardianship arrangements that were formalized through tribal councils rather than state courts. The legal precedent exists. It's just never been applied to a situation quite like ours. They were interrupted by the sound of voices calling from across the lake. 2 figures were approaching through the forest, Dr. Campbell and Ranger Collins, arriving a day early and on foot rather than by helicopter. That's interesting, Thomas observed, standing to get a better view. They're hiking instead of flying. That suggests they want to have a more informal conversation. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. These visits had become routine, but he never stopped worrying that Dr. Campbell might decide he belonged elsewhere, that the legal obstacles would prove insurmountable, that this life he'd come to love would be taken away. Thomas must have sensed his anxiety. "Whatever they have to tell us, we'll face it together," he said gently. "And remember, you have a voice in this decision. They can't simply override what you want without very compelling reasons." Dr. Campbell and Ranger Collins emerged from the tree line looking tired but determined. They'd clearly been hiking for several hours, and their backpacks suggested they were planning to stay overnight. "Good morning," Dr. Campbell called as they approached the cabin. "I hope you don't mind us arriving early. We wanted to have more time for a thorough conversation." "Of course," Thomas replied. "You're always welcome here. Can I offer you coffee?" "Food? Coffee would be wonderful," Collins said, shouldering off his pack. It's been a long hike from the nearest road. They gathered around the table where Marcus and Thomas had been studying legal documents, and Marcus noticed that both visitors seemed more relaxed than during previous meetings, less official and more genuinely interested in understanding their situation. "Marcus," Dr. Campbell began, "how have you been feeling about living here? Any second thoughts, any concerns, anything you want to discuss?" "I've never been happier," Marcus replied honestly. "Thomas is teaching me things I never would have learned in school, and I feel like I'm becoming the person I was meant to be, instead of trying to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be." Dr. Campbell made notes on her tablet, but Marcus noticed she was smiling slightly. "Can you give me some examples of what you've been learning?" Marcus launched into an enthusiastic description of their recent projects, building a solar heating system for the cabin, studying the migration patterns of birds that use the lake as a rest stop, learning to preserve food using traditional techniques that didn't require electricity or modern equipment. As he talked, he saw Dr. Campbell's expression shift from professional assessment to genuine interest. "You're keeping detailed records of your education?" she asked Thomas. "Marcus keeps a daily journal of his activities and learning," Thomas replied, "and I maintain lesson plans and progress assessments. We're covering all the core subjects required by state standards, plus practical skills and advanced topics that interest him." Ranger Collins leaned forward. "That brings us to why we're here. We've made significant progress on the legal front, but we need to discuss some important details with both of you." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. "Good news or bad news?" "Mostly good news," Collins replied with a smile. "But the good news." Dr. Campbell opened her tablet and pulled up several documents. First, Ranger Collins's research into the land status has been confirmed by 3 different legal experts. Paradise Lake does indeed exist in a jurisdictional gray area that could potentially be governed by alternative legal frameworks. "Potentially?" Thomas asked. "The key word is autonomous," Collins explained. "If you can establish Paradise Lake As a recognized autonomous community, you could create your own family law within that framework. But it requires meeting certain criteria and going through a formal recognition process. Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of criteria? Self-sufficiency is the big one, Dr. Campbell said. You'd need to demonstrate that your community can provide for its own needs without requiring government services or support. That includes education, healthcare, food production, shelter, and economic sustainability. We already do most of that, Marcus pointed out. True, but you'd need to formalize it. Create official educational curricula. Establish healthcare protocols. Document your resource management systems. Set up some form of economic activity that connects you to the broader world. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. That's all achievable. But what about the guardianship issue specifically? Colin smiled. That's where things get really interesting. If Paradise Lake is recognized as an autonomous community, you could establish your own family court with jurisdiction over custody matters. You could literally adopt Marcus under your own legal system, which would then be recognized by state and federal authorities under existing treaties and precedent agreements. Marcus felt a surge of excitement. So we could make it completely legal? More than legal, Dr. Campbell said. You could make it official in every sense of the word. Marcus would have all the documentation he needs: birth certificate, recognizing Thomas as his guardian, educational records, healthcare records, everything required for him to function in the broader world when he chooses to. When I choose? Marcus asked. That's another important point, Dr. Campbell continued. Even if this arrangement becomes permanent, you'll need to maintain connections to the outside world. Regular contact with social services, annual assessments, and the option to leave if you ever decide this life isn't what you want. Thomas looked directly at Marcus. How do you feel about those conditions? Marcus considered carefully. I think they're fair. I want to stay here with you, but I also want to know that I'm choosing this freely, not just because I don't know what other options exist. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Colin said, his expression becoming more serious. The recognition process isn't simple or quick. It could take months, possibly years, to work through all the legal requirements. And during that time, Marcus would need to remain officially in state custody, even though he'd continue living here. What does that mean practically? Thomas asked. It means continued weekly check-ins, formal educational assessments, and the possibility that if anything goes wrong, if Marcus is injured, if his education falls behind state standards, if there are any safety concerns, he could be removed immediately while the legal process continues. Marcus felt a chill of fear. So even though we're making progress, we're still not safe. Dr. Campbell reached across the table and touched his hand gently. Marcus, I want you to understand something. When I first came here, I was prepared to recommend your immediate removal. I thought this arrangement was dangerous and irresponsible, regardless of good intentions. And now? Now I think this might be the best possible outcome for you. I've never seen a child thrive the way you have in just 3 weeks. Your educational progress is remarkable, your emotional development is healthy, and your relationship with Thomas is clearly beneficial to both of you. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I also have a responsibility to protect you, which means I can't ignore potential risks just because the current situation is working well. The ongoing oversight isn't because I don't trust Thomas, it's because I need to be able to document that this arrangement continues to serve your best interests. Thomas nodded understanding. Dr. Campbell, I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to consider unconventional solutions. The oversight doesn't concern me, I welcome the accountability. But I need to know that Marcus won't be removed arbitrarily, that any concerns will be discussed with us before action is taken. That's exactly what I'm proposing, Dr. Campbell replied. A collaborative approach where we work together to ensure Marcus's welfare while respecting the unique nature of your family. Collins pulled out a thick folder of documents. "If you're both willing to proceed, we can begin the formal recognition process immediately. I've already identified the legal pathways and prepared most of the initial paperwork. The first step is establishing Paradise Lake as a distinct geographic and cultural entity." "Cultural entity?" Marcus asked. "You'll need to develop a set of community values, governance principles, and traditional practices that define your way of life," Collins explained. "It doesn't have to be complicated, but it needs to be documented and consistent with your actual lifestyle." Thomas looked around at their home, at the life they'd built together in just a few weeks, and Marcus could see him envisioning how to formalize what had grown naturally between them. "The values are easy," Thomas said. "Respect for nature, self-sufficiency, education as a lifelong pursuit, the importance of chosen family, the right to live differently without harming others. And our traditional practices?" Marcus added, getting into the spirit of the exercise. "Sustainable living, traditional food preservation, storytelling, hands-on learning, community decision-making." Dr. Campbell smiled. "You're already thinking like legislators. I think you'll find this process more manageable than you might expect." They spent the rest of the day going through the requirements step by step. Collins had done extensive research into successful autonomous community applications, and he walked them through examples of how other groups had navigated the legal complexities. The process would involve 3 main phases: establishing geographic boundaries and resource management plans, documenting educational and healthcare systems, and creating governance structures that could interface with existing legal frameworks. Each phase would require review and approval from multiple agencies, but Collins was optimistic about their chances. "The key advantage you have," he explained, "is that you're not asking for anything from the government, no funding, no services, no special privileges. You're simply asking for the right to govern yourselves according to your own values, which is a principle with deep roots in American law." That evening, as Dr. Campbell and Collins settled into the guest room that Thomas had built years ago but never expected to use, Marcus sat with Thomas on the dock, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "Are you worried about the legal process?" Marcus asked. "Not worried, exactly," Thomas replied, "but aware that it's complicated and could take a long time. Are you prepared for that? For months or years of uncertainty while bureaucrats review our paperwork." Marcus considered this. "I think I'd rather live with uncertainty here than with certainty somewhere I don't belong," he said finally. "And besides, uncertainty isn't necessarily bad. It means the future is still being written, that we have a chance to create something new." Thomas smiled. "When did you become so wise?" "I learned from a very good teacher," Marcus replied, leaning against Thomas's side and feeling the gentle strength that had become his anchor in a world that suddenly felt full of possibility. "Thomas," Marcus said quietly, "no matter what happens, with the legal process, you saved my life. Not just by giving me a home, but by showing me that being different isn't something to hide from. You taught me that differences can be gifts." "You saved mine too," Thomas replied, his voice soft with emotion. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to have a family, to have someone who needed me and accepted me exactly as I am. You gave me a purpose, beyond just surviving." Above them, a meteor streaked across the sky, bright and brief and beautiful. Marcus made a wish not for the legal process to succeed, though he wanted that desperately, but for time to continue unfolding the way it had. For these precious weeks, full of learning and laughter and the quiet joy of belonging exactly where he was, the future remained uncertain, full of legal complications and bureaucratic hurdles, and the possibility that forces beyond their control might still separate them. But as Marcus fell asleep that night in his own room, in the home that Thomas had built with his own hands, he felt something he'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that he was loved for exactly who he was, and that whatever challenges Lay ahead, he wouldn't have to face them alone. Outside his window, Paradise Lake reflected the stars like promises, and the forest whispered its ancient songs of endurance and hope. 6 months after Dr. Campbell's first helicopter visit, Paradise Lake transformed into something Marcus had never imagined when he'd first arrived. What had begun as a refuge for two outcasts was becoming a legitimate community with its own identity, traditions, and growing reputation among legal scholars. Studying alternative governance models, the change wasn't just bureaucratic, it was physical and cultural. Thomas had built additional structures to accommodate the requirements for autonomous community status. A formal schoolhouse where Marcus's education could be properly documented. A medical clinic stocked with supplies and equipment for basic health care. And a workshop where they produced handcrafted furniture and tools that had become their primary economic activity. Word of their unique situation had spread through academic circles and legal communities, bringing a steady stream of visitors who came to study what was being called the Paradise Lake experiment. Anthropologists wanted to understand how they were developing their own cultural practices. Legal scholars were fascinated by the precedent they were setting. Educators came to observe Thomas's teaching methods and Marcus's remarkable progress. Marcus found himself becoming something he'd never expected, a spokesperson for alternative family structures and educational approaches. At 9 years old, he was giving interviews to researchers, corresponding with other children in unconventional situations, and helping to document a way of life that challenged fundamental assumptions about how children should be raised. Dr. Harrison from the University of Washington is coming next week, Thomas announced over breakfast on a foggy October morning. She's bringing a film crew to document our daily routines for a documentary about experimental communities. Marcus looked up from the letter he was writing to a girl named Emma, who lived in an intentional community in Vermont. Do you think having cameras here will change how we act? I hope not, Thomas replied. The whole point is to show people what our life actually looks like, not some performed version of it. The attention was both validating and overwhelming. Marcus loved that their story was inspiring other families to consider non-traditional arrangements, but he sometimes missed the complete solitude they'd enjoyed during their first weeks together. Paradise Lake was still remote and peaceful, but it no longer felt entirely separate from the world. The legal process was advancing more quickly than anyone had expected. Collins had submitted their community recognition application in August, and preliminary approval had come through in September. They were now in the second phase, demonstrating their educational and healthcare systems, and early reviews were extremely positive. Marcus's academic progress had become legendary among educators who studied alternative schooling methods. He was reading at a high school level, had mastered mathematical concepts typically taught to students 3 years older, and was conducting independent research projects that impressed visiting scholars. More importantly, he was developing critical thinking skills and creative problem-solving abilities that traditional schooling rarely fostered. The secret, Thomas explained to Dr. Harrison during her visit, is treating education as an exploration rather than a series of requirements to be fulfilled. Marcus learns because he's genuinely curious about the world, not because he's required to memorize information for tests. Dr. Harrison was filming Marcus as he worked on his latest project, a detailed study of the lake's ecosystem that involved water chemistry analysis, fish population surveys, and botanical cataloging of shoreline plants. Marcus, she asked, adjusting her camera angle, do you ever miss traditional school? Having classmates your own age, playing organized sports, participating in typical childhood activities. Marcus paused in his examination of a water sample under the microscope Thomas had acquired from a university surplus sale. I think about it sometimes, he said honestly. I wonder what it would be like to have friends my age, to be part of a larger group. But I also know that in traditional school, I probably would have been the weird kid who asked too many questions and didn't fit in very well. And here? Here, asking questions is what you're supposed to do. Being curious and different isn't a problem to be solved. It's a strength to be developed. Dr. Harrison turned her camera toward Thomas. How do you ensure Marcus isn't becoming isolated from his generation? That he'll be able to relate to other young people when he's older? We maintain connections, Thomas replied, gesturing toward the stack of letters on Marcus's desk from children in similar situations around the country. Marcus corresponds with dozens of other kids who are being raised in alternative communities or unconventional family structures, and we have regular visitors who bring news and perspectives from the outside world. But is correspondence enough? What about direct social interaction? Marcus looked up from his microscope. Dr. Harrison, can I ask you something? How many of your childhood friends are you still close to as an adult? She paused, considering. A few, but not many. So maybe the quantity of childhood friendships isn't as important as learning how to form meaningful connections with people who share your values and interests, regardless of their age, Marcus suggested. I have more genuine friendships now than I ever had in traditional settings. That afternoon, Dr. Harrison interviewed both Marcus and Thomas separately, asking questions about their relationship and their long-term plans. Marcus found himself articulating thoughts he hadn't fully realized he'd been having. The thing people don't understand, he told her, is that Thomas and I aren't trying to recreate a normal family. We're creating something new that works for who we actually are. Thomas isn't trying to be my father in the traditional sense, and I'm not trying to be a typical son. We're partners in building a life that makes sense for both of us. Partners? Thomas teaches me things, but I also teach him things. I help him remember how to connect with other people, how to trust that not everyone will be afraid of him. And he helps me understand that being different isn't something to apologize for. That evening, after Dr. Harrison and her crew had set up their camp by the lake, Marcus found Thomas sitting on the dock, staring out at the water with an expression he couldn't quite ride. Are you worried about the documentary? Marcus asked, settling beside him. Not worried, exactly, Thomas replied, but aware that once our story becomes public, everything will change again. We'll lose some of the privacy and autonomy we've fought so hard to establish. Marcus nodded, understanding. Do you think we should have said no to the filming? No, I think sharing our story is important. There are probably thousands of children and adults out there who would benefit from knowing that alternative families are possible, that you don't have to fit into conventional molds to be happy and successful. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Over the past months, these evening conversations had become one of Marcus's favorite parts of their routine quiet time, to reflect on the day's experiences and plan for tomorrow's adventures. Thomas, Marcus said eventually, I've been thinking about something Dr. Harrison asked about making friends my own age, and I think I want to start corresponding with kids who aren't necessarily in alternative communities. Regular kids who might be curious about different ways of living. Thomas turned to look at him. That's a wonderful idea. How would you go about it? Maybe through schools? I could write letters to classrooms, share what I've learned about sustainable living and hands-on education. Some of those kids might write back, and we could become pen pals. You want to be an ambassador for alternative education? Marcus grinned. I like that title. Ambassador Marcus Chin of Paradise Lake. Over the following weeks, as autumn settled deeper into the mountains and the first snows began to dust the highest peaks, Marcus launched his correspondence project. With Dr. Campbell's help, he connected with several elementary schools whose teachers were interested in exposing their students to different educational approaches. The response was overwhelming. Marcus received hundreds of letters from children asking about his life, his education, his relationship with Thomas. Many expressed envy for his freedom and the hands-on nature of his learning. Others were curious about what it was like to live so far from civilization. Marcus answered every letter thoughtfully, describing his daily routines, sharing photographs of Paradise Lake, and encouraging his correspondents to think critically about their own educational experiences. He became, without intending to, a spokesperson for the idea that learning could be joyful and relevant to real life. "You're changing minds," Thomas observed as Marcus worked through his daily stack of mail. "These children are going home and asking their parents why they can't learn the way you do. Is that good or bad?" "It's necessary," Thomas replied. "Change happens when people see that alternatives are possible, that the way things have always been done isn't the only way they can be done." In November, their legal status took another significant step forward. The State Review Board approved their educational and healthcare documentation, moving them into the final phase of the autonomous community recognition process. They were now just waiting for federal approval, which Collins expected to receive before the end of the year. Prospect of official recognition brought both excitement and trepidation. Once Paradise Lake was formally acknowledged as an autonomous community, Marcus and Thomas would have the legal standing they'd worked toward for months. But they would also have new responsibilities and increased scrutiny from various government agencies. "Are you ready to be an officially recognized family?" Marcus asked Thomas as they worked together in the workshop, crafting a dining table that had been commissioned by a family in Seattle, who had heard about their furniture through the documentary project. "I've been ready since the day I met you," Thomas replied, running his massive hands over the smooth wood surface they'd spent weeks perfecting. "But I want to make sure you understand what it means. Once the adoption is finalized under our community's legal framework, I'll be your guardian in every official sense. You'll be my responsibility until you're 18, and I'll be legally accountable for your welfare and development." Marcus paused in his sanding. "And I'll be your son." "Yes," Thomas said softly, "in every way that matters." "Thomas," Marcus said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. Even if none of this legal stuff had worked out, even if we'd had to separate, you still would have been my family. You still would have been the person who saved me and showed me who I could become." Thomas knelt down to bring himself closer to Marcus's eye level, something he still did during their most important conversations. "Marcus, you saved me too. I was existing before I met you, but I wasn't really living. You gave me a reason to engage with the world again, to hope for something beyond just surviving." On December 15th, exactly 11 months after their first meeting on Main Street in Millbrook, the call came that changed everything. Collins phoned with the news that their federal recognition had been approved. Paradise Lake was now officially acknowledged as an autonomous community with the right to govern its internal affairs according to its own established laws and customs. "Congratulations," Collins said, his voice crackling over the satellite phone. "Connection. You are now legally empowered to formalize Marcus's adoption under the Paradise Lake Community Family Court." The adoption ceremony took place 3 days later on a crisp December morning with snow falling gently outside the windows of their cabin. Dr. Campbell officiated, having been appointed as the first family court judge for Paradise Lake Community, a role that made her both the legal authority for their proceedings and a permanent part of their extended family. Marcus wore the only formal clothes. He owned a button-down shirt and slacks that Thomas had special ordered from a catalog. Thomas had somehow acquired a suit jacket that fit his enormous frame, though Marcus suspected he'd had it custom-made during one of his mysterious supply trips to the outside world. "Marcus Chun," Dr. Campbell said, reading from the official documents they'd spent months preparing. "Do you choose Thomas Grimm to be your legal guardian, with all the rights and responsibilities that relationship entails?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Thomas Grimm, do you accept the responsibility of being Marcus's legal guardian, committing to provide for his physical, emotional, and educational needs until he reaches the age of majority?" "I do," Thomas said, and Marcus could hear decades of longing fulfilled in those two simple words. Then, by the authority vested in me by the Paradise Lake Community Charter, I declare that Marcus Chun is now the legally adopted son of Thomas Grimm, with all rights and privileges accorded to family members under the laws of this autonomous community. Dr. Campbell smiled as she handed them the official adoption certificate, a document that had required the creation of entirely new legal frameworks, but was now as valid as any traditional adoption decree. "Welcome to your new official family," she said, "though I think we all know you've been a family in every way that matters for quite some time." That evening, Marcus sat at his desk writing in the journal he'd kept since his first day at Paradise Lake. The entry was longer than usual, trying to capture the significance of a day that had legally formalized what his heart had known for. "Months. Today I officially became Thomas's son," he wrote. "But really, I think we became father and son that first day on Main Street, when he knelt down to talk to me at eye level and I realized that someone finally saw me for who I really was. I keep thinking about all the kids who are still waiting in orphanages or foster homes, hoping someone will choose them. I want them to know that families come in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes the person who's meant to love you doesn't look anything like what you expected. Tomorrow we start our official life as the Grimm family of Paradise Lake. I think my parents would be happy to know that even though they couldn't stay with me, they led me to someone who could. And I think they'd be proud of the person I'm becoming, living here in these mountains with my giant father, who sees magic in everything and taught me that being different is the best gift you can give the world." Outside his window, Paradise Lake reflected the stars, and the forest whispered its ancient songs of belonging and hope. Marcus closed his journal, turned off his lamp, and fell asleep in his own room, in his own home, as the officially adopted son of Thomas Grimm, the gentlest giant who had ever lived, and the father Marcus had never dared to dream he might find. 5 years had passed since the adoption ceremony, and Paradise Lake had become something neither Marcus nor Thomas could have imagined during those first uncertain days together. What began as a refuge for two outcasts had evolved into a beacon for families worldwide who were seeking alternatives to conventional living arrangements. Marcus, now 14, stood nearly 6 feet tall, still dwarfed by Thomas, but no longer the small boy who had once fit comfortably on his father's shoulder. His voice had deepened, his features had sharpened, and his confidence had grown into something that commanded respect from adults twice his age. But the curious, thoughtful nature that had first drawn Thomas to him remained unchanged. "The delegation from Finland arrives tomorrow," Marcus announced, reviewing the schedule on his tablet as he and Thomas worked in their expanded workshop. "They're particularly interested in our conflict resolution protocols and our approach to adolescent education." Thomas smiled as he carefully carved intricate details into a rocking chair commissioned by a family in Oregon. "Conflict resolution protocols. Listen to you, sounding like a diplomat." "I am a diplomat," Marcus replied with a grin. "Ambassador Marcus Grimm of Paradise Lake Community, remember?" The title had become official 3 years earlier when several European countries had begun sending delegations to study their governance model. Marcus had discovered a natural talent for explaining complex concepts to visitors from vastly different cultural backgrounds, and his fluency in 4 languages acquired through correspondence with children worldwide made him an invaluable interpreter of their community's principles. Paradise Lake now hosted delegations, researchers, and families seeking guidance almost year-round. Thomas had built additional cabins to accommodate visitors, and they'd established a formal education center where other children could come for short-term residencies to experience alternative learning approaches. "Sometimes I wonder if we've become too successful," Thomas mused, pausing in his carving. "Remember when it was just the two of us, figuring things out day by day?" Marcus looked up from the table he was staining. "Do you miss it, the solitude?" "I miss the simplicity sometimes," Thomas admitted. "But I love what we've built together. And I'm proud of who you've become, not just because of your accomplishments, but because you've stayed true to yourself while growing into someone who can help others find their own paths. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor neither had expected. A young woman emerged from the forest path, travel-worn and carrying a backpack that suggested she'd been hiking for days. But it was her companion that made both Marcus and Thomas freeze in recognition. Walking beside her was a giant, not as tall as Thomas, perhaps 12 feet instead of 15, but unmistakably of the same impossible nature. The first person of Thomas's kind that either of them had ever encountered. "Thomas Grimm?" the woman called as they approached the workshop. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and this is David. We've traveled a very long way to meet you." Thomas set down his tools and stepped outside, his massive frame casting a shadow that the newcomers didn't flee from. David, the other giant, raised his hand in greeting, a gesture that spoke of someone accustomed to peaceful interactions rather than the fearful encounters that had defined Thomas's early experiences. "How did you find us?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Your story has spread farther than you might realize," Dr. Vasquez replied. "David has been following news of Paradise Lake for 2 years, ever since the European documentaries began airing. He wanted to meet someone else who understands." Marcus stepped forward, studying David with the analytical curiosity that had become his trademark. The other giant appeared to be younger than Thomas, perhaps in his 20s, with the same weathered skin but none of the deep sadness that Thomas had carried when they first met. "David," Marcus said, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Marcus. How long have you been different?" David knelt down to shake Marcus's hand, the same instinctive gesture of respect that Thomas had always shown. "Since I was 16, he replied. His voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Spanish was his first language. "But unlike Thomas, I was fortunate enough to have family who didn't abandon me when I changed." "Family who stayed?" Thomas asked, and Marcus could hear decades of pain in that simple question. "My grandmother," David explained. "She was a curandera, a traditional healer in our village in Guatemala. When I began growing, she recognized it as something that had happened before in our family's history. She helped me understand that I wasn't cursed or dangerous, just chosen for something different." Dr. Vasquez opened her backpack and pulled out a thick folder. David's grandmother kept detailed records of similar transformations in their family line going back 6 generations. She believed it was connected to exposure to certain mineral springs in the mountains, springs that her ancestors considered sacred. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Like the water Thomas drank in the cave?" "Possibly," Dr. Vasquez replied. "We're researchers studying what we call transformative phenomena, cases where individuals experience dramatic physical changes that can't be explained by conventional medicine. We've documented 17 cases similar to yours and David's across 6 continents." Thomas sank down onto a tree stump that served as his chair, his expression stunned. "There are others?" "Not many," David said gently, "but enough to suggest that what happened to you isn't unique or random. There seems to be something in certain places on Earth's sacred sites, natural springs, areas where the geological conditions create unusual mineral combinations that can trigger these transformations in rare individuals. But why?" Marcus asked. "What's the purpose?" Dr. Vasquez smiled. "That's what we're trying to understand." But David's grandmother had a theory that intrigues us. She believed that giants appear during times when communities need bridges, people who can see beyond normal human perspectives because they've been forced to live outside normal human society. "Bridges," Thomas repeated thoughtfully. "Think about what you've accomplished here," David said, gesturing around Paradise Lake. "You've created a model for alternative family structures, challenged assumptions about education and community governance, and inspired hundreds of families to consider new ways of living. You've become a bridge between conventional society and something entirely new. Marcus looked at his father, the gentle giant who had saved him from a life of institutional care and taught him that differences were gifts to be celebrated rather than flaws to be hidden. For the first time, he began to understand that their story was part of something much larger than either of them had realized. "How many others know about us?" Thomas asked. "More than you might think," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Your documentary sparked a global conversation about alternative families and communities. We've been contacted by single parents, unconventional couples, multi-generational families, and communities of choice who all cite Paradise Lake as inspiration for their own experiments in living differently." She pulled out a map marked with dozens of colored pins. "Each of these represents a community that has referenced your model in their own development. There's an intentional community in New Zealand founded by 3 single mothers who wanted to raise their children collectively. A group of retired teachers in Maine who are homeschooling neighborhood children using your educational approaches. A community in Kenya where extended families are caring for orphan children using governance principles similar to yours." Marcus studied the map, overwhelmed by the scope of their influence. "We started something without even realizing it." "You proved that families don't have to fit traditional molds to be successful," David said. "That children can thrive outside conventional systems when they're given love, structure, and the freedom to develop their unique abilities." That evening, as David and Dr. Vasquez settled into one of the guest cabins, Marcus found Thomas sitting by the lake, staring out at the water with an expression of wonder he'd never seen before. "How are you feeling about meeting David?" Marcus asked, settling beside his father on the dock. "Like I've been holding my breath for 48 years and can finally exhale," Thomas replied. "I always wondered if I was the only one, if what happened to me was some kind of cosmic accident. But knowing there are others, that there might be a purpose to it all. Does it change anything for us?" Thomas looked down at his son, no longer the frightened 8-year-old who had chosen trust over fear that day in Millbrook, but a confident young man who had grown into someone Thomas was proud to call family. "It changes everything and nothing," Thomas said. "Nothing about our relationship, nothing about our love for each other, nothing about the life we've built here, but everything about how I understand my place in the world." "David wants us to consider establishing a network," Marcus said. "Connecting the communities that have been inspired by our model, creating formal relationships between families who are trying alternative approaches. What do you think about that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we've always been teachers without realizing it. Maybe it's time to become teachers intentionally." The next morning brought news that would reshape their future once again. Dr. Campbell arrived with representatives from the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization who had come to discuss designating Paradise Lake as a UNESCO site for experimental education and alternative community development. "You've created something unprecedented," explained Dr. James Mitchell, the UNESCO representative. "A successfully functioning autonomous community with its own legal framework, educational system, and governance model. But more than that, you've demonstrated that love and understanding can transcend all the arbitrary categories that divide people." He gestured toward Thomas and Marcus, who stood side by side, the giant and the young man who had found in each other the family they'd both been seeking. "Your story has inspired a global movement toward more inclusive definitions of family, more flexible approaches to education, and more creative solutions to social challenges. UNESCO would like to support expanding that influence." Marcus looked at Thomas, then at the delegation of international representatives, then at David and Dr. Vasquez, who represented the possibility of connection with others who understood their unique perspective. "What would that mean, practically?" Marcus asked. "Funding to expand your facilities and programs," Dr. Mitchell replied. support for research into alternative education and community governance models, and most importantly, a platform to share your approach with communities worldwide that are struggling with similar challenges. Thomas knelt down beside Marcus's chair, a gesture he still made during their most important conversations, even though Marcus was now tall enough that the height difference was less dramatic. "What do you think?" Thomas asked quietly. "Are you ready to help lead a global movement, or would you prefer to keep our family and community smaller and more private?" Marcus looked around at Paradise Lake, the place that had given him everything he'd never dared to hope for. A home where he belonged completely. A father who loved him unconditionally. A purpose that grew from their shared understanding of what it meant to be different in a world designed for everyone else. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that we've been given something precious, not just our relationship, but a model that could help other people find their own versions of belonging. If we can help more children find families that truly see them, more adults discover that there are alternatives to loneliness, then we have a responsibility to try." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his entire face just as it had that first day in Millbrook. "Then we'll do it together. Just like everything else." 6 months later, Paradise Lake had become the headquarters for the Global Alternative Families Network, connecting thousands of unconventional communities across 6 continents. Marcus, at 15, had been appointed as the youngest UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador in history, traveling to speak at conferences about inclusive family structures and educational innovation. But despite the international recognition and the constant stream of visitors and delegations, the heart of Paradise Lake remained unchanged. Every evening, Thomas and Marcus still sat on their dock, watching the sun set behind the western peaks, talking about the day's experiences and planning tomorrow's adventures. "Do you ever regret choosing me that day in Millbrook?" Thomas asked. One evening as they watched a family of deer come down to the lake to drink, Marcus, now taller than many adults and speaking with the confidence of someone who had addressed world leaders, looked at his father with the same trust and love he'd shown as an 8-year-old boy. "Thomas," he said, "choosing you was the first real choice I ever made in my life. Everything good that's happened since then grew from that moment, when I decided to trust you instead of running away. And I'll never stop being grateful that you saw past the surface to who I really was underneath." "We saved each other," Marcus said simply. "And now we get to help other people save each other too." Above them, the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky. The same stars that had witnessed a frightened giant and a lonely orphan boy finding family in each other 5 years earlier. Paradise Lake reflected their light like promises, and the forest whispered its ancient songs of love conquering fear, of differences becoming strengths, and of families that chose each other, creating bonds stronger than anything fate or genetics could provide. In the distance, a loon called across the water, and Thomas and Marcus, father and son by choice, partners in building a world where everyone could belong, sat together in perfect peace, knowing that their story had become part of something larger than themselves, while remaining, at its core, exactly what it had always been, a testament to the transformative power of unconditional love and the courage to embrace what makes us different. The giant's shadow no longer fell across the world as something to be feared, but as shelter for anyone brave enough to step inside and discover that sometimes the most unlikely people become the most necessary families, and that home isn't a place you're born into, but a sanctuary you create with the people who see your true self and choose to love you exactly as you are. 10 years after that first helicopter visit, Marcus Grimm stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly, addressing world leaders about the fundamental human right to belong. At 19, he had graduated with honors from the alternative education system he and Thomas had pioneered, earned early admission to 3 universities, and chosen instead to dedicate his life to expanding the global network of inclusive communities. They had started, behind him on the massive screen, Images of Paradise Lake showed the evolution of their home, from a simple cabin where a giant and an orphan boy had found each other, to a thriving center where dozens of families now lived and learned together. The lake still reflected the mountains, but the shoreline now featured a cluster of sustainable buildings that housed the Alternative Families Institute, a school where children from around the world came to experience education tailored to their unique needs and learning styles. "Honorable delegates," Marcus said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned early that being different was not a disadvantage. "I want to tell you about transformation. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet revolution that happens when we stop trying to fit people into boxes they were never meant to occupy." In the audience, Thomas sat in a specially designed chair that accommodated his 15-foot frame, beaming with pride as his son addressed the world's most powerful leaders. Beside him sat Dr. Campbell, now director of the International Council on Alternative Family Structures, and David, who had become Thomas's closest friend and partner in research about the phenomenon that had changed their lives. The community at Paradise Lake began with a simple recognition, Marcus continued. Two people who didn't fit anywhere else found that they fit perfectly together. But that recognition has grown into something none of us anticipated, a global movement proving that families can be formed by choice, education can be joyful and relevant, and communities can govern themselves with wisdom and compassion. The numbers were staggering. Over 3,000 communities worldwide now operated using principles developed at Paradise Lake. Children, who might have been lost in traditional systems, were thriving in environments designed around their strengths, rather than their deficits. Adults who had felt isolated and misunderstood were finding purpose in creating inclusive spaces for others. But the real transformation, Marcus said, clicking to a slide showing a graph of decreased youth suicide rates in countries with strong alternative family support systems, isn't in the statistics, though they're encouraging. It's in the individual stories. The 12-year-old in Brazil who was considered unteachable until she found a community that recognized her genius for environmental science. The elderly widower in Japan who thought he had nothing left to contribute until he became a grandfather figure to 30 children in an intentional community. The refugee family in Germany who found belonging not through assimilation, but through a community that celebrated their cultural differences. Marcus paused, looking directly at Thomas, whose presence had once terrified an entire town but now brought comfort to anyone struggling to find their place in the world. Each of these stories began the same way ours did, with someone brave enough to see past surface differences to the person underneath, and someone else brave enough to trust that they might be accepted exactly as they are. After the speech, as delegates gathered for reception discussions about implementing alternative family support programs in their countries, Marcus found himself in a quiet corridor with Thomas, just the two of them for the first time in days of international conferences and media interviews. "I'm proud of you," Thomas said simply, and Marcus felt the same warmth he'd experienced as an 8-year-old boy hearing those words for the first time. "We did this together," Marcus replied. "Every word I spoke up there came from lessons you taught me about courage, about love, about seeing possibilities where others see problems." Thomas smiled. "You've far exceeded anything I could have taught you. You've become exactly who you were meant to be." "So have you," Marcus said. "Remember that first day when you told me you'd been hiding for 43 years? Look at you now addressing international delegations, mentoring other giants, helping families around the world find their own versions of Paradise Lake." They walked together through the UN corridors, the giant and the young man whose story had sparked a global reimagining of what families could be. Other delegates stepped aside not from fear, but from respect, many stopping to shake their hands and share how Paradise Lake's model had influenced policies in their own countries. "What's next for us?" Marcus asked as they emerged onto the steps of the UN building, New York City sprawling before them. "Home," Thomas said. Back to Paradise Lake. Back to the families who are building their lives there. Back to the work that matters most, helping individual people find where they belong. Marcus nodded, thinking of the latest group of residents at Paradise Lake. A teenage mother who had been rejected by her family. An elderly man whose adult children couldn't understand his need for community rather than isolation. 3 siblings who had aged out of foster care and were learning to create stability for themselves. Dr. Vasquez wants us to visit the spring in Guatemala where David was transformed, Marcus said. She thinks understanding the geological processes might help U.S. identify other sites where similar transformations could occur. More giants? More bridges, Marcus corrected, using David's grandmother's term. More people called to help others cross from isolation to belonging. As they waited for their flight home, Marcus opened his laptop and began typing his daily journal entry, a habit he'd maintained since his first day at Paradise Lake. The entry captured not just the events of the UN speech, but his reflections on how far they'd all traveled from that morning when a frightened giant had appeared in Millbrook's morning mist. Today I spoke to world leaders about the power of chosen family, he wrote. But the most important conversation was the one I had afterward with Thomas. Just the 2 of us in a quiet hallway, remembering where we started and marveling at where love has taken us. Sometimes I think about that 8-year-old boy who chose trust over fear on a chaotic street in Millbrook. I wonder if he could have imagined this life, not just the international recognition or the global movement, but the simple daily joy of belonging completely to someone who sees all of you and loves every part. Tomorrow we fly home to Paradise Lake, where new families are building their own stories of transformation. And I get to help them, alongside the best father anyone could ask for, a gentle giant who taught me that our differences aren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts to share with a world that desperately needs what only we can offer. The flight to the mountains was smooth, and as their small plane descended toward the landing strip Thomas had built years earlier, Marcus pressed his face to the window to see Paradise Lake spread below them like a jewel set in green velvet. The buildings they'd constructed over the years dotted the shoreline, but the lake itself remained unchanged, crystal clear water reflecting sky and mountains. Eternal and peaceful. Home, not the place where they'd been born, but the sanctuary they'd created together, where every person was valued for exactly who they were, where differences were celebrated rather than hidden, where love was the only requirement for belonging. As they walked from the airstrip to their cabin, the original structure where their story had begun, Thomas and Marcus were greeted by the current residents of Paradise Lake. Children ran to hug Marcus and marvel at Thomas's size, while adults shared updates about their projects and progress. This was what they'd built together, not just a community, but a living proof that families could be formed by choice, that education could be tailored to individual genius, that governance could be based on wisdom rather than power. That night, as had become their tradition after any extended absence, Thomas and Marcus sat on their dock watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations, their legal struggles, their growth into a family that had inspired thousands of others. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, as he always did during these quiet moments of reflection. "Only that we can't help every person who's still searching for where they belong," Marcus replied. "But we're trying. We're succeeding," Thomas corrected gently. "Every family that finds courage to live differently, every child who grows up knowing they're perfect exactly as they are, every community that chooses inclusion over conformity, they're all part of what we started here." Marcus leaned against his father's side, still small enough to fit comfortably in the shelter of Thomas's massive arm, and felt the same sense of absolute safety and belonging he'd experienced that first night at Paradise Lake. Their story had grown beyond anything either could have imagined, from a chance encounter between 2 lonely souls to a global movement reshaping how humanity thought about family, education, and community. But at its heart it remained exactly what it had always been, a testament to the transformative power of unconditional love and the courage to embrace what makes each person irreplaceably unique. In the distance, a loon called across the water, and Paradise Lake reflected the stars like promises of all the tomorrows still waiting to unfold, filled with more families to help, more barriers to break down, more proof that love really can conquer fear, and that home isn't where you come from, but where you're accepted completely for who you truly are. The giant's shadow had become shelter for anyone brave enough to step inside and discover that the most unlikely people often become the most necessary families, and that belonging is not something you're born into, but something you create with those who see your true self and choose to love you exactly as you are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.